at 47 years old. Eleanor Whitfield stood ankle-deep in the march mud of the dooryard that had been hers for 22 years, watching a stranger nail a notice to her own front door. It was Silas Bramwell, president of the Hollow Ridge Trust and Loan, who had called in her late husband's debt the moment the ground thawed enough to make eviction convenient, and who now watched her from horseback with an expression of practiced regret that did not reach his eyes. She had $11.40 sewn into the hem of her traveling skirt, a Bible that had belonged to her mother, and a wagon whose wheel had begun to crack somewhere past the Shenandoah crossing. With what little remained after the auctioneer's fees, she paid $4.75 for a worthless, forgotten mountain parcel the county called Abernathy's Folly, a tract so cursed by rumor that not a soul in Rockfield County had bid against her. It was, by any sensible measure, the last foolish act of a ruined woman. But sealed beneath the hearthstones of that abandoned cabin, and further still in the granite folds of the mountain above it, lay something that had waited 90 years to be found, something that would not only save Eleanor Whitfield, but would set right a wrong that had bent an entire community out of shape for 3 generations. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Eleanor Whitfield. If you have ever felt cast off by the very ground beneath your feet, tell us in the comments where you're watching from tonight. Eleanor had not always been a woman who understood loss so intimately. She had been born Eleanor Poe in 1805, in a modest limestone farmhouse at the foot of the Alleghenies, the third daughter of a surveyor's assistant named Michael Poe, a careful, quiet man who spent his working life walking behind wealthier men with a chain slung over his shoulder, measuring out other people's fortunes acre by acre. It was from her father that Eleanor learned to read a map the way other girls learned to read scripture, with reverence, and with the understanding that a line drawn in ink could decide whether a family ate that winter or did not. He taught her, on Sunday afternoons when the chores were finished, how a compass needle trembled before it settled true, how a chain could be laid crooked by a careless man or an honest one made to look crooked by a dishonest one, and how the oldest surveys, the ones cut into blazed trees and buried in cornerstones, held a kind of truth that no courthouse fire could ever quite erase. She did not know, as a girl of 12 sitting cross-legged on the porch with her father's old field book open across her knees, that this knowledge was being planted in her like a seed meant to lie dormant for 35 years before it flowered. Her mother, Ruth Poe, was the kind of woman the mountain folk called capable, which in Rockfield County was the highest compliment a woman could receive. Ruth taught her daughters to preserve, to mend, to doctor a sick calf and a sick child with equal steadiness, and above all to hold their heads level no matter what the world did to knock them sideways. It was Ruth who used to say, while she worked a needle through worn cloth by firelight, that nothing God made was truly worthless, only misplaced, and that the patient hand would always find the use in a thing that the impatient hand had thrown away. Eleanor carried that saying with her the way other women carried a locket, turning it over in quiet moments, not yet knowing how literally her mother's words would one day come true. She married Thomas Whitfield in the spring of 1826, when she was 21, in the little clapboard church at Hollow Ridge, a town cupped in a green fold of the mountains where the Bramwell family had held land and influence since before anyone living could remember. Thomas was a farmer, broad-shouldered and slow to anger, a man who loved his creek-bottom acres with the same steadiness he loved his wife, and together they built a life that was not grand but was, for 22 years, entirely their own. They raised corn and hogs and 2 sons who grew tall and left for Ohio country in search of cheaper land, writing letters home that Eleanor kept bundled in ribbon in the bottom of her trunk. They buried one infant daughter beneath a dogwood tree on the hill behind the house, a grief Eleanor carried privately and permanently, the way a woman carries a stone worn smooth by years of touching it. Thomas often said that Eleanor had a surveyor's mind wrapped in a farmwife's hands, that she could walk a fence line and know, almost by instinct, where the old iron pins had been moved a foot this way or that. It was a small, half-joking observation that neither of them yet understood was a kind of prophecy. The Whitfield farm sat, as it happened, directly against the eastern boundary of Bramwell land, a boundary that had been disputed in a quiet, simmering way for as long as Eleanor had lived in the valley. The current boundary, the one recorded in the county courthouse and etched onto every map made after 1765, ran along a line that always seemed, to the old-timers, to bend a little too generously in the Bramwells' favor wherever it crossed good bottomland or creek frontage. Old men at the mill would mutter about it over their pipes, how the original line, the one supposedly run before the Revolution, before even the founding of the county, had been lost when the first surveyors vanished into the high country and were never seen again. Nobody living had ever seen that original survey. It had passed, over 90 years, from fact into folklore, the kind of half-remembered story that mothers told children to explain why certain hollows were avoided and certain mountain trails were left to grow over with laurel and briar. Eleanor had heard the story 100 times without ever imagining that she would one day hold its ending in her own two hands. Thomas Whitfield died in the autumn of 1848, thrown from a half-broken horse while helping a neighbor clear a fallen tree from the county road, and Eleanor buried him beside their infant daughter on the hill and told herself, in the numb months that followed, that grief was a debt a person simply paid down slowly, year after year, until it was settled. She did not know that her husband, in a moment of neighborly generosity 2 years before his death, had co-signed a note for a struggling cousin, a note that cousin never repaid, a note that had quietly accrued interest under the careful management of the Hollow Ridge Trust and Loan, whose president was none other than Silas Bramwell, grandson of the very man who had drawn that disputed boundary line 90 years before. It was Silas who came to her in the winter of 1852, dressed in a good wool coat, his boots too clean for a man who claimed to have ridden all the way from town on business, to inform her with practiced sorrow that the note, plus its accumulated interest, now exceeded the value of everything she owned. He offered her, he said, more time than the law required, though the time amounted to 11 weeks before the sheriff arrived with papers in hand. Eleanor watched the auctioneer sell her milk cow, her husband's tools, the clock that had been her mother's, piece by piece, to neighbors who would not meet her eyes, and she understood, with the particular clarity that only total loss can provide, that Silas Bramwell had wanted this land back for reasons that had nothing to do with an unpaid note and everything to do with the creek that ran, cold and clean, exactly along the boundary his grandfather had drawn 90 years earlier, a boundary Eleanor, daughter of a surveyor, had always privately believed was a lie. She left Hollow Ridge proper with her flour sack of belongings and her $11.40, intending only to find some cheap room in the county seat until she could decide what a woman of 47, with no farm and no husband, was meant to do with the remainder of her life. It was on the courthouse steps, waiting for the county land auction to finish its business, that she heard the auctioneer laughingly offer up the last unclaimed parcel on his list, a tract high in the mountains above Hollow Ridge that nobody had bid on in 11 years running. Abernathy's Folly, the old men called it, after Jonas Abernathy, the chief surveyor who had led a royal survey party up into those mountains in the summer of 1762 to fix the boundary lines of a great land grant, and who had vanished there, along with his 5 men, their instruments, their mules, and their records, swallowed whole by an early snowstorm that came down off the ridge without warning. No trace of the party was ever found. A second survey, run in 1765 by a young man named Josiah Bramwell, Silas's own great-grandfather, had established the boundary lines the county still used to this day, lines that, as far as anyone could recall, no one had ever thought to question, since there was no original survey left against which to check them. The mountain land itself, the high, rocky, useless ground where Abernathy's party had last been seen, had passed from hand to hand for 90 years without ever being cleared, farmed, or wanted, until it belonged to no one at all but the county, which was glad enough to be rid of it for $4.75. Eleanor bought it not because she believed in curses or dismissed them, but because it was the only ground in Rockfield County she could afford, and because some small, stubborn part of her, the part that was still her father's daughter, wanted very badly to stand on land that Josiah Bramwell's family had never managed to touch. The cabin on the Folly had not been lived in for decades, and it showed her every one of those years the moment she pushed open its sagging door, a single room, dirt-floored in one corner, its stone hearth cold and choked with a bird's nest, its roof more sky than shingle in 2 places. She wept only once, quietly, sitting on the edge of the rope bed frame that some earlier trapper had left behind, and then she did what her mother had raised her to do, which was to get up and begin making the place livable, because a woman who sat still in her grief would freeze before the week was out. It was while clearing the hearth of 40 years of soot and swallows' nests, prying loose a hearthstone that had cracked and settled crooked, that Eleanor found the first thing that told her Abernathy's folly had not always been empty of secrets. Beneath the stone, wrapped in oilcloth gone stiff and dark with age, lay a single folded page, water-stained at its edges but legible, written in a careful, surveyor's hand she recognized immediately, because it was the same hand her own father had once taught her to read. It was a page torn from a field book, dated the 14th of September, 1762, and signed at the bottom, in ink gone the color of rust. Jonas Abernathy, Chief Surveyor, Colony of Virginia. The page itself was mostly technical, columns of bearings and distances that meant little to anyone who had not been raised, as Eleanor had, at a surveyor's knee. But at the bottom, in a smaller, hurried hand, as though written in haste or in fear, Abernathy had scrawled a single private line that had nothing to do with boundaries at all: "The chain lies safe where the split hemlock stands above the hollow, and God keep whoever finds it honest, for there are men below who would not thank us for what we carried up." Eleanor read it 3 times by the light of her single candle, her hands unsteady, and understood, with a certainty that ran through her like cold water, that this cabin had not been the survey party's final camp at all. It had only been a way station. The true camp, and whatever Jonas Abernathy had been so afraid of losing to dishonest men, lay somewhere higher up the mountain, above the hollow, near a hemlock split by lightning or age, waiting exactly where he had left it 90 years before. For 3 days Eleanor told herself she would not go looking. She had a roof to patch and a garden to break and no earthly business chasing an old man's riddle up into laurel thickets where, if the stories were true, 5 men and their pack mules had frozen and vanished without a trace. But her father's voice would not leave her, the voice that had taught her a survey line always tells the truth to the person patient enough to walk it, and on the 4th morning, with a hatchet, a coil of rope, and a heel of cornbread wrapped in cloth, Eleanor Whitfield began climbing. She found the split hemlock on the 2nd day of searching, a tree so old and so scarred by some ancient lightning strike that its trunk had grown into 2 separate crowns, standing sentinel above a narrow hollow so choked with rhododendron that no cattle, no hunters, and certainly no surveyors sent by Josiah Bramwell had troubled to push through it in 90 years. Beneath an overhang of grey stone, sheltered from 9 decades of snow and rain by the mountain's own shoulder, Eleanor found what remained of Jonas Abernathy's camp, preserved in the strange, arrested way that only high, dry, forgotten places can preserve the past. Canvas had rotted to threads. Iron chains and instruments lay rusted but whole beneath a blanket of leaf mold. And half buried beneath a fall of stone that had come down from the overhang at some point in the intervening decades, stone that had, ironically, protected rather than destroyed what lay beneath it, she found a strongbox of iron and oak, its lock long since given up to rust, its lid still sound enough to shelter what was inside. Eleanor knelt there a long while before she opened it, aware in some deep, unhurried part of herself that she was about to become the first living person in 90 years to look upon whatever Jonas Abernathy had died trying to protect. When she finally lifted the lid, she found, wrapped in oilskin gone brittle but intact, the original field notes and the signed, sealed survey plat of the 1762 boundary, the true line, drawn by a careful and evidently frightened man, running not where the county's maps now placed it, hugging tight along the ridge, but a full half-mile further east, along the natural creek line that every farmer in the valley below had always sworn, in their private grumbling, was where the boundary ought to have been all along. Beneath the survey documents lay something else, a bundle of personal letters, a woman's silver locket engraved with the initials M.A., and a final page, written in a different, younger hand, that of Abernathy's own son-in-law and assistant surveyor, a young man named Peter Hale, describing, in the plain, unadorned language of a man who believed he might not live to see morning, how a rider had come up from the valley 3 days before the storm closed in, a young land agent's clerk named Josiah Bramwell, asking too many pointed questions about where exactly their line would fall, and offering, with an eagerness that had unsettled every man in camp, to guide them down before the weather turned. Abernathy had refused the offer, mistrusting the man's haste, and it was that refusal, Peter Hale wrote, that likely doomed them, for the storm came sudden and hard, and by the time it broke, the trail Bramwell had promised to show them was buried under 4 feet of snow, and no rescue ever came looking in the place where they truly were, because the story that reached the valley, a story only Josiah Bramwell could have told, since he was the last man to see them, placed their camp a full mountain range away from where it actually stood. Eleanor sat with that strongbox open in her lap for a very long time, the mountain wind moving through the split hemlock above her, and understood that she was holding, in her 2 hands, both a murder 90 years cold and the truth that could unmake 3 generations of Bramwell wealth. Word travels fast in a small mountain county, even when a woman tries her best to keep her business quiet, and it was not 2 weeks before Silas Bramwell himself rode up the old logging trail to Abernathy's Folly, his good coat traded for a plainer one, his manner far less patient than it had been on the courthouse steps. He had heard, he said, that the widow Whitfield had been digging around up on the mountain and finding things that did not belong to her. Eleanor, standing in the doorway of her half-mended cabin with flowers still on her hands from the morning's baking, told him plainly and without apology exactly what she had found, because she had already decided, in the quiet nights since her discovery, that hiding the truth was not a habit she intended to take up at 47 years old. Silas's face, she noted, did not so much pale as harden, the particular hardening of a man recalculating, in real time, how much a lie was worth defending. He offered, first, to buy the mountain parcel back from her outright, at a price 4 times what she had paid, an offer so far above the land's worth that it told her more plainly than any confession could have exactly how much he understood was buried in that hollow. When she declined, gently but firmly, he tried a different approach, suggesting that whatever old papers she believed she had found were likely forgeries, or the ramblings of men lost and freezing and out of their right minds, and that no court in Virginia would set aside 90 years of settled boundaries on the word of a widow with no standing and no proof beyond a box of moldering paper. When even that failed to move her, his tone changed a 3rd time, into something quieter and colder, a suggestion, never quite spoken outright but perfectly understood, that a woman alone on an isolated mountain, far from any neighbor's help, ought to think carefully about her own safety before she went stirring up business better left buried. Eleanor did not sleep easily after that visit, and she was honest enough with herself to admit it. But she was not, and had never been, a woman who scared quietly into silence, and in the weeks that followed she did what her father had taught her a surveyor always does when the truth is disputed, she gathered her evidence, checked it against itself, and prepared to show her work. She rode down into the valley and found Amos Kessler, the county's aging deputy surveyor, a man old enough to remember when the boundary dispute was still openly discussed rather than politely forgotten, and together they walked the true line described in Abernathy's original plat, driving new stakes alongside the old creek, and Amos confirmed, with his own instruments and his own trembling but still capable hands, that the bearings matched, that the mathematics held. That this was, without question, an authentic and internally consistent survey older than the one every deed in the county currently relied upon. She spoke, too, to old widow Calloway and to the Pruitt brothers and to half a dozen other families whose land bordered the disputed line, families who had spent 3 generations paying rent or taxes or simply quiet deference on ground that, if Abernathy's survey was correct, had never rightfully belonged to the Bramwells at all. She did not ask them for anything. She only told them the truth and let them decide, on their own, what it was worth to them. It was Amos Kessler who suggested, in the end, that Eleanor bring the matter before the full county court at its spring session, when the land records were customarily reviewed and any citizen might petition to correct an error of record. Silas Bramwell, hearing of the petition, arrived at the courthouse that morning with his own lawyer and his own confident bearing fully restored, prepared to dismiss the whole affair as the fantasy of a grieving, desperate woman clutching at old paper to avoid the shame of her own foreclosure. But Eleanor had not come alone, and she had not come only with paper. She had brought Amos Kessler and his verified field measurements. She had brought Peter Hale's letter, describing a rider who came up from the valley asking pointed questions 3 days before the storm. And she had brought, laid carefully upon the courtroom table alongside the 90-year-old survey plat, the county's own original 1765 resurvey record, the one drawn by a very young Josiah Bramwell, which Amos had located in the courthouse archive and which showed, to anyone willing to look closely, a suspicious and unexplained inconsistency. The boundary Josiah had drawn did not match the terrain description in his own written notes, notes which, read carefully, described the creek line boundary and then, in a different and more hurried hand, redrew the final map a half-mile further west. The courtroom that day grew very still as Eleanor Whitfield, a widow in a plain traveling skirt, laid out 90 years of quiet theft with the same patient, unhurried clarity her father had once used to teach a 12-year-old girl how a compass needle settles true. She did not raise her voice. She did not accuse Silas Bramwell of murder, though the implication sat heavy and unspoken in the room, since Peter Hale's letter spoke for itself and every man present understood exactly what it meant that Josiah Bramwell alone had known where the party truly camped and yet had let the search go looking in the wrong mountains entirely. She spoke instead of the land itself, of the families who had paid taxes and deference for 3 generations on ground that was never rightfully taken from them, and of a dead man's final, desperate hope that whoever found his chain would prove honest with it. The county court, after 2 days of deliberation and one furious, ultimately unsuccessful legal challenge from Bramwell's lawyer, ordered the boundary resurveyed according to Abernathy's original 1762 line. It was not a swift or a simple undoing. Land does not give itself back easily, and there were deeds to untangle and titles to correct that would occupy the county clerk for the better part of a year. But when the new stakes went into the ground that autumn, following the true creek line boundary a dead man had died trying to protect, more than 400 acres that had quietly belonged to the Bramwell estate for 90 years reverted to the families whose ancestors had farmed and fenced and buried their dead beside it all along, among them a narrow strip of good bottomland that, once restored to its rightful boundary, ran directly alongside what remained of the old Whitfield farm land. Eleanor was able, at last, to buy back at its true and now modest value, the note against it having been thrown into serious question once the court began examining the Hollow Ridge Trust's other dealings. Silas Bramwell did not go to prison, no court could try a man for a great-grandfather's sins, and Peter Hale's letter, however damning in its implication, proved nothing beyond suspicion under the law. But the Hollow Ridge Trust and Loan, its reputation for fair dealing shattered in a single spring session of county court, saw its depositors withdraw in numbers enough to close its doors within 2 years, and Silas himself, stripped of the land and the leverage that had made him the valley's quiet king, sold what remained of his holdings and left Rockfield County altogether, moving west, some said, to a place where the name Bramwell did not yet carry the weight of an unpaid debt. It was not the vengeance the old men at the mill might have wished for him. It was something quieter and, in its way, more complete. A man who had built his family's comfort on a lie simply woke one day to find the lie no longer held his weight, and the mountain, patient as it had always been, let him go. Eleanor Whitfield did not build herself a grand house on the strength of what she had found. She kept Abernathy's Folly, mended its roof properly at last, and planted a garden where the trapper's cabin had stood, and in the hollow above it, near the split hemlock, she and Amos Kessler placed a simple stone marker bearing 6 names, Jonas Abernathy, Peter Hale, and the 4 other men of that lost survey party, so that anyone walking the ridge in years to come would know that honest men had died there doing careful, faithful work, and that the ground remembered them even when the county records had not. She used what remained of her small share of restored land not to enrich herself further, but to help old widow Calloway repair a washed-out bridge and to see that the Pruitt brothers' reclaimed acreage was properly fenced before winter, because her mother's old saying had proven, in the end, entirely true, nothing God made was truly worthless, only misplaced, waiting for a patient hand to find its proper use. And so we return, as we always do, to where we began, to a woman of 47 standing in the mud of a dooryard that was no longer hers, believing she had nothing left in the world but $11, a cracked wagon wheel, and a foolish $4 parcel that everyone else in the county had refused even to bid upon. Eleanor Whitfield did not find a treasure on Abernathy's Folly, not in the way treasure is usually understood. She found a truth that had been waiting patiently in the mountains keeping for 90 years, sealed away by a dying man's hope that whoever discovered it would prove honest with what they carried. She was. And because she was, 400 acres returned to the families who had always deserved them, a dead surveyor's name was carved at last into stone instead of silence, and the quiet debt owed by one dishonest man's ambition, 90 years overdue, was finally, fully paid. Thank you for spending this time with us and with Eleanor Whitfield tonight. If her story moved you, we'd be grateful if you'd share it with someone who might need reminding that what looks worthless to the world is not always worthless in truth, and that patience, properly kept, has a way of settling old accounts. Before you go, we'd love to know, what is a time you found real value in something the rest of the world had already written off? Tell us in the comments below, we read every one. Until next time, stay close.